Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we've built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We work with life science companies across the globe, helping them to virtualize everything from their advisory board meetings, medical education events, publication groups, investigator follow-up teams. We've even launched something called Insight Events. So companies can launch large corporate events, sales training, and hackathons all virtually. But more importantly, we really believe at Impetus that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious, really courageous types of conversations, we can work with some of the digital provocateurs, the leading edge thinkers, the digital thought leaders out there so that we can all work to collectively and really positively disrupt healthcare. But more importantly than just starting that conversation, we need to work together to sustain that conversation. We need to build on it. And this is precisely the reason that we built the asynchronous platform, where we merged asynchronous and synchronous through the Insight platform to have these ongoing discussions where we can build and reach consensus and really drive these agendas forward with some of these new ideas. So I'm super excited to have Venk Varadan with us today. He's doing some really, really cool work. He's actually the co-founder and CEO of a company called Nanowear. This is actually a New York-based connected self-technology platform for non-invasive diagnostics and chronic disease management. It's actually built on a first of its kind cloth-based nanosensors. So this is my first real conversation on this because I talk about these really cool technologies all the time, but we're talking about something that's really going out there. So I'm super stoked to discuss this. Nanowear's first product launch, Simple Sense, is an undergarment for congestive heart failure, monitoring as well as management. But before founding Nanowear, Venk spent about 7 years in technology investment banking, focusing exclusively on venture-backed software and communications technology. Prior to his Wall Street career, he spent around 3 years in sales and marketing roles, both at all our famous pharmaceutical companies, Eli Lilly, as well as Sanofi Aventis Pharmaceuticals, based in New York. So Venk received his MBA from Columbia University in finance and entrepreneurship. And he also has his Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry from Duke University. Welcome, Venk. So stoked to have you on the show today.
Natalie, it's a pleasure. I'm super excited as well. I think your series of podcasts over the last year have been amazing. I think we're almost at episode 100 here. So pleasure to be and humbled to be a part of it. Thanks for having me.
Beautiful. I love what you're doing, but you've also had a really interesting career trajectory. A lot of the people that listen to this podcast are from the pharmaceutical, life science, biotech space. Myself, my business partner, we're all traditionally in the pharma companies that you belong to. So it's really neat to see that you don't have to lock and load and stay in those companies, that there's lots of exciting things you can do in both in finance and then obviously in entrepreneurship. So tell us what drove you away from the golden handcuffs of pharma and got you into the space you're in today.
It's a great question. As by academic training, it was, biochem and biomedical engineering, and I thought forever I'd just go to medical school. I was one of those people that thought college would never end, and when it does, you go to med school. About a week before college graduation, I had probably my first panic attack and realized I'd be in school for a much longer time and really never explored anything beyond that sort of North Star goal. So decided to defer for a year. I broke my father's heart on that one, and did a sort of a broad program, volunteer program with the Red Cross and Plan in the Caribbean. Sort of did that for several months, and then came back and thought I'd be more motivated to go to med school, and it actually did the opposite. It motivated me to jump into industry to potentially have a broader impact. So I didn't have a logical entrance into corporate, just having been a science and engineering guy. Got fortunate to land a role at Eli Lilly in sales and marketing, worked with several brand teams in primary care products as well as specialty products, and then moved over to to Sanofi, I don't think there was really a thought that I needed to leave pharma. I think it was more, I really needed to formalize a little bit of my business education, sort of having been a career sort of scientist to some extent. And, if I wanted to be an executive, I got to learn more things than just talking about products, right? So went to business school at Columbia and focused on finance and entrepreneurship, took out more debt at another expensive school. So kind of that pushed me into Wall Street. Started in investment banking and like I said, did a lot of work during the Web 2.0 years of 2010 and onwards, where companies like Facebook's, their valuation was changing every week, on a private basis. And so it was a pretty exciting time working with companies that were really, rocket shipping, starting to work with companies who were 10, 20 people. And then, within a year, there were 100 people. And I think that kind of planted my bug for entrepreneurship, sort of seeing these CEOs and management teams, which if you just read in the papers, you kind of think that these are superstar people that are genetically engineered to be, something super special. And then you kind of start working with them and you realize, yes, of course, they're super brilliant and super hardworking, but it's really just about bulling the horns. Can I run through walls and do it as stretched thin as possible with a great idea, obviously. And so I think that's what kind of gave me the push into entrepreneurship. Didn't really have a good idea to base on. And this is sort of where our co-founder and chief innovation officer, who is my father, Dr. Venk Varadan, sort of planted the idea in my head. He's a career 40+ year academic researcher in biomedical and electrical engineering. This is a culmination of his life's work. He was doing carbon nanotube technology before nanotechnology was even a phrase. Wow. For defense-related applications, submarine coating, missile defense systems. Just as any good scientist kept thinking about what was next. If I can detect, super low frequencies and sonar at 50 meters or 100 meters underwater, what's to say I can't detect really low frequency biomarkers with the same sort of thesis from the skin? And obviously you can't use carbon nanotube technology on the skin because carbon's corrosive, but the sort of iterations of that really led to our core technology, which you mentioned in the intro, which is cloth-based nanotechnology, which is capable of picking up clinical grade fidelity of 85 dimensions of biomarker data from the body across the heart, lungs, and upper vascular system. And I think when we can be bucketed as a wearable because of that, but it's the breadth and the depth of the data is really what sets us apart from the data capture and transmission standpoint, which obviously fuels the vast potential for the AI and virtual care, which I know we'll be talking about. But
yeah, so Venk, this is awesome. It's so neat to see the turnaround that now your dad's probably super happy that you didn't go to medical school.
I didn't disappoint him ultimately. I didn't disappoint him ultimately by coming back to my science roots. So
yeah, and it's so fascinating. And I was actually just going to say what you were talking about, watching the Facebook skyrocket. Investment banking has never been more interesting now with SPACs and retail investors and everything's kind of going crazy. Are you finding that you're enjoying this side of that part of the world, being on the entrepreneurship side, or is there a part of you that still misses the investment banking and the craziness associated with that? What are some of the major differences that you're finding being an actual entrepreneur?
Sure. I think just to be an entrepreneur, you're sort of wired to not look backwards, just in general. And sure, there are things that I loved about the large corporate career and sort of working from one project to another with different companies. That's super exciting, right? Don't get that wrong. But I absolutely love my job, and I think you have to, as an entrepreneur, if you're not in love with your space, you're never going to learn fast enough to build a real company. And especially on the frontier of stuff that we're doing, which there is no pattern recognition to look backwards on the economic model or the technology model side. It hasn't gone without its times of crisis, as any entrepreneur. There have been several times, over the past 6 years, where we didn't know when we'd be able to fund payroll next, and you got to be creative and keep hustling and build a great network. And so despite the stressful times, we're in a pretty awesome place now, which I know we'll be getting to. And when times are good, it's obviously exciting, but it becomes more rewarding when you go through the murky times as well. And wouldn't trade it for the world. Love what's going on right now, and love my job. Love the team.
Yeah, so really interesting that there's a connection, obviously, with the big thought leader, which is your father, who started, really the fundamentals of the technology. So let's actually just think. So as an average person who basically puts clothes on, what is different and interesting about Nanowear? Tell us a little. Describe to us what what is that you're selling?
Sure. So if we were in person, or if the audience was in person, and I could pass around a sample of the cloth that is basically our core sensor technology that captures and transmits biomarkers with basic skin contact. If you were to touch the active sensor area, it would feel felt like or swayed like. And that feltiness that you're feeling is actually billions of vertically standing nanosensors per centimeter of surface area. So if you think, not to get too deep into the physics, but if you think of each of those nanosensors or nanopillars as an individual sensor or electrode, the difference what we have versus every other sensor that's out there, from smartwatches to the gel electrode patches to adhesives, is that we've got exponentially higher surface area. We're getting billions of skin of contact touch points in a limited amount of space. And because we have billions of them, we can functionalize the tips to capture different things. So most wearables are looking at maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 different biomarkers. We're looking at 10 plus just from a raw data standpoint. And because we can get so clean and so narrow on the types of frequencies we're looking for, we can actually extrapolate and derive even more biomarkers from the composite data that we're capturing. So I'll get to the clothing aspect and the actual application in a second, but because of that sort of uniqueness of the advanced materials, we can actually capture electrical signals, hemodynamic signals, or flow characteristics, volume-based characteristics in your heart and lungs and your vascular system. We can capture acoustics, so sounds of your heart. We can capture activity, movement, posture, and even in some cases, metabolic information. So the breadth of it is sort of clear that we're sort of multi-parameter, multivariant. But what's super important is that it's all time synchronous, right? If COVID taught us anything, you can't just look at the heart in a vacuum, or the lungs in a vacuum, or the vascular system in a vacuum. They all work together, right? And so if you're not assessing all of them at the same time with one product, you're probably missing out on the insight of how each individual's patient sort of unique digital signature is progressing through a disease or in recovery. And I really feel like that's what the frontier of this next 10 years of digital health is. Can we really produce a unique digital signature of each human, and not just bucket us as 35-year-old male of South Asian descent or something like that? So that's really the premise of Nanowear. And now to the product itself, we were actually really romantic with the idea of clothing when we first got started. So our first prototype was actually a tank top for men and a bra for women. The minute we started getting our MVPs, we were showing great clinical fidelity, benchmarking against gold standard devices. But then we went to hospital systems, we went to OEMs that would be our potential customers. This is probably in year 2 of our 6-year journey so far. The hospital admins and procurement, vendors would say, "Venk, I love this tank top. I love this bra, but I have no idea how many 6-foot, 300-pound men are coming in this week. I have no idea how many 34 double B cup sizes are coming in this week. And I'm not going to store 7 different sizes, right? For men and for women." So one of those shovels that hit you over the head as a first-time founder, realizing, hey, inventory management is going to be a big problem here. So it kind of forced us to, how do we do something that's gender neutral and size adjustable, but still maintain the vectors of measurement across the largest slice of the heart, the largest slice of the lungs, and the upper vascular system. So the product itself is actually, we call it sort of like a vest or a sash. It goes over your right shoulder and across your thoracic cavity. and it's got an adjustable strap here and an adjustable strap over the shoulder and an adjustable strap on the side. Super easy for a patient to put on by themselves, which is part of the draw here, and doesn't require a sort of medical professional to fit them, right? Because of the nanotechnology, we don't need to nail location. We can be a little bit off based on different sizes of torso length and BMIs, and we're still good. So that product itself actually transmits to a patient mobile app, where a patient starts the test, stops the test, and can log symptoms with the touch of a button on the app screen. And those symptoms timestamp to the waveforms that we send to our server. That's where our AI and our sort of analytics engine runs and scores the data, pushes that down to the physician portal, where they can look at the raw data if they want to, but they can also look at the trends and the scoring. And again, the value there is sort of all of the metrics time synchronously. You're kind of replacing a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff, a Holter monitor, and a respiration machine all in one with this sort of vest. So I know in your intro you mentioned that the first product was for congestive heart failure. That was actually pre-COVID. Heart failure is still on the roadmap for sure. But as you can imagine, once COVID hit, there were use cases that we never even thought of that came out of the woodwork. Primary care wasn't really a market for us. People were happy to go into the doctor's office, or not happy, but maybe they, happy to go into the doctor's office and get their regular physical. When that sort of changed, people were looking for solutions like us. Can we replace those standard diagnostic tools in a 30-minute visit and maybe do it in 15 minutes now? Post-surgical recovery, elective surgery, never really a market for us until COVID. But you can't come in for day 1, day 4, day 7 visits anymore post-surgery if you don't have to, right? So I think we went from transformational and cool before COVID to, damn, we needed this yesterday. You know what I mean? When COVID kind of accelerated and gave the shock to the much needed digital adoption that I think healthcare has been long starving for.
So I see that you have been cleared by the FDA 510K. So is this now considered an actual medical device or a diagnostic? How exactly is this being used? And was this prior to COVID, or was this an accelerated approval because of COVID? Tell us a little bit about how you went through the regulatory hoops for something like this.
Yeah, it was actually a sort of multi-step strategy that we put into place about year 2, year 3. And I hate using the word pivot because we didn't really have to pivot. It kind of just expanded the aperture of the use cases. The clearance that we got in November is for the vest, the mobile app, and the sort of digital transmission of the related biomarkers that we capture and transmit. So as I mentioned, electrical signals, hemodynamic signals, acoustic signals. There was a strategy in getting that part cleared first. So we sort of classify ourselves ultimately as a remote diagnostic. We don't have clearance for diagnostics immediately. That's all on the software AI side. We really wanted to take care of the hardware device and the transmission itself between the vest, the hardware, the mobile application, and the server before we started saying, hey, we can diagnose hypertension. So while we can calculate blood pressure, we're not indicated to diagnose hypertension. That's soon coming, knock on wood. But that was really our strategy, Natalie, in take a stepped approach in sort of getting everything that's providing the data into the cloud that you are ultimately analyzing in a closed loop system to diagnose different indications. So over the next year, we're planning on submitting several algorithmic or AI machine learning based algorithms for different diagnostic use cases across the cardiopulmonary and vascular coupling, which we do. The product itself, Simple Sense, as you mentioned, we were in the middle of a heart failure study. Really, that seemed to be the only logical use case before COVID, both from an economic standpoint and in what we were basically providing. We were kind of copying a study that Boston Scientific did with an implantable device in sort of looking at electrical, hemodynamic, and acoustic signals, combining it all into an algorithm, and ultimately getting an assessment of worsening heart failure versus an algorithm from an algorithm from the implantable device. So we felt like we could do all the same stuff, but not in the body, outside the body, and sort of address this $40 billion problem of heart failure patients getting readmitted to the hospital, in some cases 7 to 10 times per year. But then when COVID hit, the heart failure study was halted, like many studies were halted as all hospitals were moving to COVID. A financing that we had in place was halted as well because people were triaging their existing portfolio. And after I sort of stopped crying for 24 hours and wondering what the future of the company would be, we called up FDA and we said, look, we know we don't have enough data for a heart failure clearance here, but could we have a discussion on maybe a broadened indication for use of a simultaneous and synchronous assessment of the heart, lungs, and upper vascular system? And typically, obviously, FDA they don't like that, right? And rightfully so, they don't like that. They want you to be narrow on your patient population and your indication and who you're working with. But I think this is a great example of industry partnering with regulators in a very, very unplanned for time, right? In COVID. And we had a 510K on the nanotechnology before, so I think that helped. Obviously, they understood the safety profile and the efficacy profile already. But also, good rapport, and again, just good sort of knees bent on sort of addressing the need here. So we sort of worked through that with leaders at the FDA for 2 to 3 months. We didn't want an emergency use authorization or accelerated approval simply because we didn't want it to be specific to COVID. And so that was another good example of partnership. So this was a standard 510K. We submitted in June. Got the clearance in November. And in the meantime, in the quiet period, we were getting calls from a lot of different potential customer channels that we are finalizing or have finalized with several, and looking forward to making some cool announcements.
Yeah,
here.
so Venk, that sounds fascinating. And quite frankly, a lot of times, you can never waste a good crisis. And it looks like you just, you were there at the right time at the right place, and there was an opening there. It may never happen again for somebody who comes in at yours, to get that, but it looks like all the stars aligned for you there, which is incredible. So during that quiet period, as you were sort of building momentum and partnerships and opportunities, tell us how are people finding you? So, at the end of the day, we realize who the target audience is. At the end of the day, you want to have primary care physicians and other individuals who need the stethoscope and the other methodologies of doing like real in-person diagnosis and monitoring and assessments. But who else? And is it directly healthcare providers, or were there larger organizations, institutions, or even pharmaceutical or other life science companies approaching you? Who is that ecosystem for you in terms of partnerships?
Yeah, it's a great question. And your point on sort of timing, just choosing us. I mean, I think we were doing all the right things, and still will be the first to admit that we got pretty fortunate with COVID sort of accelerating us. Before that, I think a lot of our current customer channels, Natalie, were a result of good sort of relationship building and learning with the big device companies that exist, the pharma companies that exist, our clinical sites that we were doing studies on. We were getting our product and even our betas in the hands of people that we were sort of formally partnered with or had very close relationships with. And I think it was it's a good example of, how long the cycle is in healthcare, that building relationships takes a long time. People aren't going to just jump into some product because it looks cool. They really need to take their time and sort of vet the fidelity, vet its use case, vet us as a management team. And I think, all of that long work while, we're focused on things that are boring, like supply chain and quality management systems and regulatory, all sort of have worked as a real strong benefit now that we sort of accelerated commercialization. So I'd say the first group of stakeholders are the device companies themselves, the large caps and mid caps that are out there across multiple specialties, whether it's, pulmonary or sleep apnea disorders, diabetes monitoring, structural heart devices, or even the big guys like Medtronic, J&J, what have you. And just built very good relationships with those product teams and the BD teams, the innovation groups. They were sort of always looking and scouting for technologies like this. And I think slowly but surely we continue to differentiate ourselves from the field. Separately, I was so fortunate to have been invited to the AdvaMed board of directors in 2019. AdvaMed is the trade association in DC that works with the industry leaders, regulatory, and Medicare for policy sort of updates, which has never been, more needed with the digital revolution here. So I got to know a lot of the CEOs of these big companies as well, which never hurts, right? So some good element of hard work and hustle, as well as some good fortune in being sort of invited onto the AdvaMed board as one of the smallest companies there. And then I think beyond that, the providers, the payers, and the pharma companies, also really good stakeholders. Again, just an example of continuing to be around the hoop, really. And, you keep chipping away, adding some more points on the board and milestones. You just become realer and realer and realer to these potential customer channels. And like I said, it kind of all came together for us over the last year with COVID really accelerating the need and the use case.
That's awesome. So exciting to hear that. One of the other difficulties sometimes when you're enrolling in new things. I mean, again, we all realize that COVID turned everybody upside down. It threw some people completely off kilter. That's why we hear about the K recovery, if you will. So there's some people who got worse, and there's a lot of other people like yourself and my company as well that have done extremely well.
Sure.
But there's an accelerated adoption of things that feel uncomfortable for the mainstream, right? So when we talk about, the bell curve of adoption. And so a big piece of this comes down to working into people's workflows.
Yeah.
And the workflows for people have just completely gone topsy-turvy, and people are like, frantically trying to come up with a new habitual system so things become automatic. Because let's be honest, our brains are lazy, and we don't want to have to think too much about, well, how do I do this and turn this thing around and strap this thing? And, how do I tell a patient about this or ship it to their home or whatever? So how did you bridge the gap, if you will, on the automaticity or the work integration, or also ultimately the app piece being interoperable with electronic health records? And so really a full integration. What was some of the systems that you used to do that?
No, it's a great question. And I think part of, your point on the brain and behavior changing, it likely doesn't happen unless it's forced to in many cases. So, that's my first sort of answer, that our platform hadn't really changed. It's basically the same since before COVID, but there was a need to change based on the shock there. And I'll give some examples. But even before that, the feedback from providers was the exact same. How many apps am I going to have? How many different platforms am I going to have? Yeah, you may give me some efficiency on the fringe here, but I'm pretty efficient on my own, and I'm not going to retrain my nursing staff to look at this app, this tablet, something like that. All valid concerns, don't get me wrong at all. And I think for us in the dev side, when we were building our product, we were trying to be students of case studies of every company that sort of came before us, all the respect in the world to them, because we learned from them. And the point of us being able to do so many different biomarkers at the same time actually eliminates the need to use 4 or 5 different products or 4 or 5 different apps. So once the physicians and the providers sort of understood that part, after they were kind of forced to sort of, hey, we need to look at digital solutions because that physician-patient relationship in many cases is no longer in person. And now after you shifted that, is the patient really going to want to come back unless they have to, right? So, there will be a pining, especially from the older generation. Let's go back to what we were, because, these guys in the best respectful ways, they're control freaks, right? And taking that control out of their hands, even if it was economically viable, was probably something they didn't want to do. Now they have to. They don't. There is no sort of question on whether they can keep that control or not. So I think the fact that they're looking for solutions now, I'm not going to use 6 apps. I'm not going to use something for blood pressure and then enter it into the computer. I'm not going to use something for my respiration, enter it into the computer. I'm not going to, look at the sounds of my heart and enter it into the computer. But what if I can do all of those at the same time with the patient just strapping on the vest at home? It feeds right into my system, right? So that's, I think, the value prop that we have been generating, that it actually improves workflow. But I think most importantly, Natalie, it actually improves efficiency. And this is where the providers see the ROI of using us, right? It's not just this is something I need to do because I need to still see my patients. Can I actually make more money with this, right? And if you can do both, that's when you get adoption, right? Now, that's what I think that we're getting there. But if you really think about what we do and the examples I gave, you go into a primary care doctor, acute illness, elective procedure, or even a specialist like diabetes, pulmonary, heart failure, where you might see the doctor once a month, once or twice a month. What's the first thing that they do in all of those cases? Touch your chest with a stethoscope, listen to your breathing, take your blood pressure, maybe do a resting ECG. And they're entering all the information into Epic, right? So we're already taking that 10, 15 minutes of the time out of the visit. And the patient loves it because they're not sitting in traffic. They're doing this at home. But there's a second thing that I think the physician community is really understanding now. When you take those measurements in the past, stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, what have you, they're only point solution measurements. They're 30 seconds of data or 60 seconds of data. And the actual other thing that's a problem is not just the short length of time that you're making a diagnostic or therapeutic assessment on. The mind knows that you're monitoring yourself, right? So it's called white coat syndrome, right? I've had my physical every year. My resting heart rate's in the high 50s, low 60s. Every time I've gotten a physical, it's in the 80s, right? And a doctor could be making a determination on that one data point per year of, what Venk Varadan's health is, right? But what if I'm giving over that 20, 30-minute visit, I'm giving you an average of 120 blood pressure calculations every millisecond, right? That's where I think we can sort of argue that the utility, not just that I'm replacing all the tools, but there's probably a level as we collect more data and the neural network continues to get smarter, that it's actually going to be more accurate down the road and more of a real snapshot in a continuous fashion of what that digital signature is of us on an ongoing basis going forward. So
Venk, I think those are great, very useful messages for the healthcare provider, for the user. I mean, those make a lot of sense. At the end of the day, this is a material that somebody has to pay for.
Sure.
And so the question comes down to is who's the payer? Is it the institution? Is it the physician? Is it the patient? At the end of the day, what is the cost effectiveness description? How are, I know you've actually shared this, but how are payers, for example, going to make money on this, or is there going to be a benefit? So as you know, I mean, a lot of times if there is long-term benefits in the fact that patients are going to be held in more wellness for a longer period of time, especially with chronic diseases and what have you, and are not going to be as apt to require surgery, or like you were suggesting earlier, longer stays in the hospital or use of emergency rooms. Have you been able to paint a whole cost effectiveness model on this, and who's ultimately the payer?
It's a great question. I think, again, back to some of the original points, not to be a broken record, but because we're replacing so many tests that are done individually and thereby improving efficiency, you're getting ROI by not having to pay for the other devices, 4 or 5 of them, but you're also getting ROI by potentially able to see more patients. If I can shrink a visit from 25 minutes to 15 minutes, in theory, you can see more patients there. But the payer is also excited about something else, which is the actual visit fee or facility cost that they currently reimburse for, let's say, an acute surgical center or a specialty visit or something like that. Those could be anywhere from $500 to $1,500, right? And if you can remove that out of the system by doing the follow-up visits virtually, that's also an ROI driver for the payer community. So I think what we're seeing is that because we're sort of just doing standard evaluation and measurement assessments across those 4 or 5 basic diagnostic tools, there's individual Medicare codes for each of those that we completely fit in for, right? And so the value is really driven that we're kind of a 5-in-1 product. And when we get the $30 code here, the $50 code here, the $30 code here, we're not asking for something super expensive or a brand new code for us. But when you tabulate all of those, it's actually, fine for us from a monetary standpoint, but it's also great for the payer and for Medicare because of the three reasons I mentioned: a reduction in facility costs, a sort of all-in-one metric where I'm not paying for 5 devices like I did before, and potentially better outcomes. Right? We're still talking about this value-based standpoint, but I think that this is going to continue to move forward when, hey, I might be able to do 5 virtual visits over the year because if I reduce the number of physical office visits from 5 to 1, everybody's winning at that point. The clinic themselves, because they can bill 1-to-1 for virtual visits, the payer themselves, because they're not spending as much as they used to, and the sort of manufacturer and digital provider like ourselves. So again, I don't think this would have happened pre-COVID, right? There wasn't 1-to-1 reimbursement for virtual visits. So again, good fortune in sort of, and another good example of CMS, a regulatory body or a government body working with industry and figuring out, hey, what are we going to actually do to serve the needs of our patients? And
Absolutely.
that was paramount.
Yeah, no, it's beautifully said, and great explanation of that. So we've talked a lot about the use cases of this, and there's many. You talked obviously about coming in an emergency way for the COVID-19 telehealth primary care physicians. We've talked about it's used in maybe post-surgical recovery.
Yep.
Also looking at acute illnesses and various procedures, but maybe we can just talk a little bit about the other big disruptor that happened during COVID, which was an abrupt stop to a lot of clinical studies, clinical trials.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people were having sort of clinical research organizations or having to go to their physicians or contract folks taking their blood and other sorts of metrics. And we had to get forced into moving towards liquid biopsies, ambient biometrics, and a whole assortment of other wearables. Where did your company come in, and what is the future plans around being incorporated proactively into clinical trials?
It's a great question. It is a market we've always been focused on. As you mentioned, there's a bunch of different applications from, just basic inpatient monitoring and inpatient telemetry, post-surgical recovery, chronic disease, primary care. Clinical studies is an obvious one because even when a drug is in phase 2 or phase 2B studies, you want sort of dynamic medical grade biomarkers off the body, again, that are sort of time synchronous. How is this not just affecting my heart and not just affecting this drug, not affecting my heart, this drug not affecting my lungs, the vascular system, but what is the drug doing to that system as a whole? And I think our differentiation, our product stack has helped in that regard. So it is on our roadmap squarely, Natalie. I'm going to take shots at your friends in pharma right now because I think pharma is one of those big organizations that just loves to pilot, right? They sort of just pilot, end on end. And the studies themselves take a long time, right? So until we start seeing some pharma companies really make concerted investments in this space, everybody understands the thesis. No one's arguing that if you have a companion diagnostic when the drug's in phase 2 trials, or even when it's out in market, to really understand what the body is doing, how it's reacting, and start to sort of understand that, like I said, a contraindication shouldn't just be for a 40-year-old male of South Asian descent, because we're not all a monolithic population. If I start to understand a digital signature, I actually understand more granularly the effectiveness of a drug in a particular person versus the risk associated with another person, right? And that's really the goal of where we should go. I can't say for sure if pharma wants all of that information or not. I'm going to be candid on that. But I think it's going to happen at some point that the investment in companion diagnostics on clinical trials is going to be unquestioned at some point. It's not just going to be Fitbit providing 2,000 watches or Apple Watch providing 2,000 watches to Stanford when Stanford's evaluating some drug, right? And we can see the trends there. You can get some information out of that, right? But I think you'll start to see more medical grade, multivariant biomarker data that are associating supervised and unsupervised learning on the AI side, because that's really what's going to give the insights that drug companies really need. So I think it's coming.
Absolutely.
I hope that this has accelerated the financial commitment, because startups, we can't just pilot forever. You know what I mean? So I think it's
Absolutely.
coming, but it's not here yet.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting world, and there's a lot of dynamics happening very quickly and around real world evidence. Where does things like patient registries and these, long-term kind of data analysis that's coming in on a consistent basis, like even 24-hour glucose monitoring is
Yeah.
example. How do these all get piled in and leveraged? There's a lot of questions on this, and you mentioned earlier around the idea of the digital avatar, and the idea of plugging in these multivaried data points into this hologram, if you will, or this health hologram of a person. You can call it their health data. And so I guess the question comes down to is, any thoughts on the ethics or the privacy or security issues associated with this digital health avatar, especially if we start integrating this from early on, especially the idea of once, for example, a baby is born and we do a full genome test,
Yeah.
we rope on one of these Nanowear straps since the day they're born, and we do this constant monitoring, obviously with the intention of wellness care. And then we always have this baseline based on the N of one, as opposed to this population-based management. But there's always going to be this issue of surveillance and,
Sure.
the dystopian, purveyor of
Yep.
all things management. So how do you sort of navigate that long-term vision with the reality of suspicion?
I may take a little bit of a cynical view on this, Natalie. First and foremost, our policy at Nanowear is that it's the patient's data. If they want it, they always have access to it. We don't obviously provide it to them because there's not a need for citizen physicians looking at their stuff all the time, running around. But if they want their data and they want to look at it, it's their data. We always give it to them. We are blinded to the actual personalized information of the data. We will know sort of male, female, age, representative comorbidities, but we don't know a name or a social security number or an address or anything like that. But I actually kind of cringe at this argument about cyber being. I sort of look at it, the risk here on the suspicion is really on what hackers can do. If patient advocacy groups and population are losing their minds about privacy and the suspicion of surveillance, I can't buy that argument, because on the consumer world, we've given all of our information away for free anyway. We're gladly doing that on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. I don't see how that's any different here. And quite frankly, if we were in a similar, I know they're not apples to apples, but if we were in a similar environment where nobody gave a damn about all the information that they're posting from pictures and address and location, I think there's a way more risk on what we do on the consumer side. But if you had a similar sort of billions of inputs that are out there in the field, you know what it's going to do? It's going to make our overall ecosystem more informed and more healthy, right? Again, this will be controversial, but in COVID itself, we knew as an industry that the major hospitalizations were predominantly obese or elderly people. We wouldn't say it publicly because we didn't want to, and rightfully so, we didn't want to discriminate against certain populations. But you can understand an argument of why a young kid in high school is just like, why am I shut down and not able to go to school? Because the hospitalizations are 90% this group. And if we were sort of as a community and as a society, as an ecosystem, had all of our information out there without this argument of surveillance, just like we do on Instagram and Facebook, I think this would have had the ability to sort of inform our citizenship more directly without being worried that we were hurting people's feelings. That's just my opinion. I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely, Venk. I mean, honestly, this is like a whole world of discussion, probably an entire other podcast that we could go into. But
right.
I really do think the future of what privacy, security, what's shareable, what's not is literally a moving target. Some people may disagree and think that it's a black and white, and I don't think it is either. So I think what that future looks like is going to be very unique and interesting. And so I do think that there's going to be multiple camps, as we've seen recently with the social unrest and the political upheaval. You can actually have two people looking at the exact same scenario or situation, and their version of reality is completely different. So, so the world is interesting. I do want to take a couple of minutes talking to you around the AI concept of machine learning being built into these really interesting nanostructures. I'm a big Ray Kurzweil fan, and he's been, predicting these nanotechnologies for years and years. I'm curious, just like with all software as medical device or a diagnostic, first of all, how does your sensors get smarter? And secondly, without giving out proprietary details, of course, but secondly, is this going to be a different mechanism over time? And and I'm just kind of curious about what the vision of making these smarter sensors, smarter units, machines, diagnostics, whatever you want to call it. And is this something that could spill out, like, for example, if you're eventually going to have a full garment or your full tensor, certain components are reading certain things, and they leverage that data and make other adjacent sensors smarter, and then it just kind of feeds into each other throughout the fabric. I'm just kind of curious what that view is.
Yeah, you're actually making my pitch for me, Natalie. So I appreciate that. But we've got some cool buzzwords now: nanotechnology-based artificial intelligence. That's pretty unique and pretty sexy, which we were never really sexy to begin with. So I like the brand on that. But the sensors themselves actually don't get smarter. The sensors are capturing and transmitting the same data that we can. We will find different and additional biomarkers that the sensors themselves can capture over time. But if I just take a step back on what AI is, and I don't want to bore the audience, but AI is really looking at historical data and then using that data to make a prediction on the future. Mm-hmm. The problem with an AI only platform, it's just software and looking at data, is actually twofold. There's an economic problem and a utility problem. I'll start with the utility problem. If I look at 1 million electrocardiographs from Mayo Clinic over the last 40 years, for example, right? And I see some trend analysis and I make a determination, I send an algorithm through a predictive algorithm based on that 40 years of data to predict something going forward. I send that algorithm through FDA, I get a 510K de novo or a clearance, and I run it out into market. The minute you take that algorithm and go to Chile or Brazil or Africa, I promise you the model's not going to work, because the population that you're utilizing it on is way, way different from the model that you trained on. So the problem with AI only is they're always looking backwards. Is there a way that when they utilize going forward that they're actually getting better without having to find more data from Africa and Brazil or Chile, right? That's the first problem from a utility standpoint, that the accuracy is not going to be widespread across all populations. Ages will be different, ethnicities will be different, elevation, temperature, all that stuff. But the economic problem is even more so. And I think this is where AI companies, while they're super sexy and have raised a ton of money, aren't really seeing the utility from an economic standpoint, because they have to pay for their data. They have to pay $3 for every data set for maybe 25 cents of revenue that they're generating. And they have to keep paying for it. For them to get smarter, they have to keep paying for data. So I don't know if that's ever going to flip on an economic side where they can really be profitable. I haven't seen in healthcare, I haven't seen it yet. But where we sort of differentiate is that we have dynamic data off of the body every millisecond. It is sort of present time data that continues to feed our neural network. So we can actually say, without having to pay for the data, that we are getting smarter every single millisecond we're on a patient, and for the different use cases. And I think that's what's unique about device-based AI, which I think is going to be the future. I think that's the only way you get to a digital avatar, digital signature. You can have a capture device on one side and AI on the other side. The market for the last 10 years couldn't get out of their own way in keeping these separate. I think the combination together, which is what we are uniquely with the nanotechnology device, but I think that's the only way you actually make the argument I'm getting smarter every single day, because the dynamic data off the body is not just being logged in some EMR that I look back at over 20, 30, 40 years, right? Static images like radiology and stuff like that, that makes sense, right? I mean, it's just like facial recognition. There's not something moving, right? It's just a point in time, it's a static image. But when you're looking at biomarkers, that's completely dynamic. Yeah. And those are different every single moment. You can't look at 30 seconds of data per day and create some AI algorithm that's going to have a lot of clinical utility. and then the economic
Absolutely.
model also.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm going to throw in and kind of, get into your investment mind and see if there's some correlation here. But with all of this discussion recently about NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and blockchain, and this whole world around democratization of stuff, getting into this era of dispersion. So I was actually just curious. I mean, right now, the way the healthcare system is based is data goes into a big data lake and it's being mined by several different people, including physicians, researchers, manufacturers, et cetera. And at the end of the day, there's people who are leveraging that data, they're mining it like oil, and then they're making money off of that. Is there a future consideration about going directly to patients, having them wear these outfits? Again, this is the democratization where they're basically, these sensors are reading their data and it gets tokenized, and somehow they make money on the data that people are using. Is that sci-fi, or is that potentially reality?
Natalie, I'm gonna date myself a little bit here in letting you know, while I am a tech CEO, I'm probably not as big of a technophile as one would assume. My understanding of the blockchain and tokens is a little bit dismissive. Not to say that I know it's not real, and will have potential from currency, commodities, sort of services as well. It's already happening, right? I certainly see a merger of those technologies into healthcare. Do I know how yet? Probably not. But I think you brought an interesting point on the patient themselves. We haven't seen the adoption that a lot of the companies sort of promised over the last 10 years, that patients are taking their health into their own hands. They are making demands. They're not following, they're leading. That is true for a small population. It's really for the healthy well, or the affluent, right? Most folks that are working 2 jobs or 3 jobs, which is the majority of our country, sadly, don't necessarily have time to track all their metrics and all these things. I think as that becomes more of a standard across from not just the affluent and the healthy well, but continues to penetrate down, and not to take shot at our elderly community, but as the younger community who has literally had a phone in their hands since they were 5 years old and have been connected to the internet their whole lives, I actually think that it's inevitable that there will be the combination of those tools where, we talked about it earlier, where maybe everybody's anonymized health data is out there in the blockchain and it's actually tradable. It's, you know what I mean? It's serviceable. I don't think the younger generation has an issue with it, nor maybe shouldn't they, because this is the world that they've lived in. And when they become policymakers, I think this is going to be the expectation, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There are so many interesting opportunities with the nanosensor technology that you're building. Obviously, we've talked about what you're currently doing, and I think you probably can talk a little bit about the launch of that and what your kind of current plans. But I'm also just thinking about projecting into the future. Everything from, I think there's dry sensors. People might be thinking, a lot of people have issues with sleep, as an example. How can these be embedded in bed sheets or pillowcases? How are people, we get a lot of people as they start aging, Alzheimer's, or various other neural biological issues and physiological disorders. So what could be the future of your technology?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that the market had to temper me on. And don't try to boil the ocean all at once, right? You can't build a business if you're a constant science project, right? But you hit the nail on the head, Natalie. We actually just got a patent awarded last month in March, our 10th patent actually that's been granted on nanosensors in bed sheets and pillows and what have you. There's an argument to put nanosensors in the steering wheel of a car. Argument to put this in, the handle of a pilot, the gloves of a pilot, in space technology, underwater technology. There's a lot of use cases of iterations of the advanced material itself and the consequent data and insights that you could score based on machine learning and AI. I think we're just scratching the surface on it, Natalie. I think in 20 years, you're going to see, hopefully it's us and we're the standard, but even if there's other companies in addition to us, you're going to see these use cases start popping up, left and right. I mean, I think a lot of the 2010 to 2020 technologies were kind of sci-fi, right? When Google and Verily came out with the contact lens that would measure your blood glucose, it didn't end up working, but that's gonna come one day. The idea of monitoring contactless, right? Is there just a hub that we're putting in the ceiling that is able to give me clinical grade, assessment of everything, inflammation in my body, muscle swelling, let alone my heart, lungs, and upper vascular system? To say that that's not coming, I think would be completely wrong. I mean, the thing about healthcare is that technology moves faster than not only healthcare, but probably we move as an evolving species. And I think once we sort of play catch up or find that sort of happy medium where we're evolving together, as opposed to reacting to technological innovation, a lot of those use cases are going to come out. We would love to be a part of all of them, as I sort of suggested, and hopefully one day we will. But in the near term, we're focused on sort of remote diagnostics in several different healthcare classes via partnership with different OEMs who know their customer base better than us. We don't say that we're experts in sleep apnea, but let's partner with the company that knows sleep apnea. We don't say we're the experts in continuous glucose monitoring, but let's partner with the company that knows that. We don't know heart failure, but let's partner with the LVAD companies or the heart pump companies. That's really what our next 6 to 12 months are going to focus on. But I think that it's just scratching the surface. And for us, we really want to prove a few use cases to sort of get the world to help, dream with us, because dreams are cool until they become an endless sort of science project, right?
I think that is super exciting. I loved the conversation with you today, Venk. It was inspirational, and I think that you guys are just moving along and definitely seeing the future of you guys being major leaders in this space. This was a fantastic conversation. For people who are interested in connecting with Venk and potentially partnering, collaborating, inquiring what is going on, what on earth is going on with their company, because there's lots. We will be leaving links to contact Venk, and please reach out to him. He'd be really happy to take that conversation. I also invite you to check out impetusdigital.com. If you enjoyed this conversation, these are the kinds of conversations that we like to manage asynchronously and synchronously with a variety of stakeholders like the Venks of the world, payers, patients, allied healthcare providers, physicians, working on hard problems, reaching consensus, gathering insights, and building some of these really awesome ideas and future technologies and ideas. This is what we do at Impetus, and we would love to hear from you as well. Please like and subscribe to this channel so that people can find the information. We would really appreciate if you could leave us a review on our podcast as well. Thank you, Venk, for a fantastic conversation, and we're wishing all of you a great day ahead.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Impetus Digital. All the entrepreneurs in digital health, keep up the good fight.